My wife's lawyer had just finished calling me a ghost, a man who'd been physically present in a marriage but emotionally absent for 2 decades. And then my 9-year-old grandson raised his hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady in a way that made every adult in that courtroom go quiet. "May I show you something that my grandpa doesn't know I have?" The judge looked down at him over her reading glasses. She nodded. When the screen lit up, my wife of 31 years turned white as chalk. "My name is Richard. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years believing I had built something real, a home, a marriage, a family worth fighting for. I worked as a civil engineer for a municipal contracting firm in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job that doesn't sound glamorous at dinner parties but keeps bridges standing and water running to people's houses. I was good at it. I was proud of it. And for most of my adult life, I believed my wife was proud of me too. Her name is Diane. We met when I was 32, and she was 29, at a church potluck of all places, the kind of meeting that sounds boring until you're the one standing next to a woman who makes you forget what you were about to say. We married 11 months later. We had one son together, Thomas, who grew up, moved to Portland, and gave us a grandson named Cooper, 9 years old, gap-toothed, obsessed with space and building things, and the kind of child who listens to everything even when adults assume he isn't. I want to be honest about my marriage, because I've had enough of dishonesty to last the rest of my life. The last several years hadn't been easy. I'd worked long hours longer than I should have, maybe. I missed a family vacation when a dam project went sideways and I was the only one who could fix it. There were dinners that went cold and anniversaries that got shifted to the following weekend. Diane had complained about those things, and she wasn't entirely wrong too. But sitting in that courtroom on a Wednesday morning in March, listening to her attorney describe me as a man incapable of emotional connection, a man who had neglected his wife for decades while she quietly sacrificed everything, I felt like I was hearing a story about a stranger. A villain written specifically for this room. The attorney's name was Gerald Foss. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who speaks slowly because he's learned that slow speech sounds more authoritative. He laid out a picture of my marriage that I barely recognized. According to him, Diane had spent 31 years raising our son largely alone, managing the household without support, and watching her husband choose work over family at every turn. He talked about missed school plays and forgotten birthdays. He talked about emotional withdrawal and chronic unavailability. Some of it had grains of truth. Enough that I couldn't stand up and simply say he was lying. But the portrait he was painting, a cold, indifferent husband who had drained the joy from his wife's life, that wasn't me. That wasn't us. Or at least I'd thought it wasn't. Diane sat across the aisle from me, looking composed. Not sad, not grieving, composed. She was wearing a navy blazer I'd never seen before, and her hair was done differently than she usually wore it. She looked polished in a way that didn't match the Diane who'd cried on my shoulder when our dog died or who called me from the grocery store just to read me funny cereal names. This woman had planned to be here. This woman had prepared. Cooper sat in the gallery with my son Thomas, who had flown in from Portland and looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Cooper had his small backpack on his lap. He'd been quiet all morning, which wasn't like him. Usually you couldn't get that boy to stop talking once he got going on something. But that morning he just sat very still, watching everything with those serious dark eyes of his, clutching the straps of his backpack like it contained something fragile. I'd tried to catch Thomas's eye a few times, but he kept looking at the floor. Foss was methodical. He presented dates, times, incidents, a log of my failures laid out like a case history. He mentioned that Diane had sought marriage counseling twice, both times without my full cooperation. He mentioned that she had expressed her needs repeatedly over the years and been dismissed. He mentioned, with the particular emphasis attorneys use when they want something to land, that she had been the primary emotional anchor for our son and now our grandson, filling a role that I had abdicated. I wanted to tell him that I'd coached Cooper's baseball team for 2 years, that I drove 2 hours round trip every other Saturday to take him to the Science Museum because his parents were both working. That last Thanksgiving, when Thomas had to fly back to Portland early, I was the one who stayed up until midnight reading Cooper 3 extra chapters of his book because he couldn't sleep. But my attorney, a competent but cautious man named Walter Briggs, had advised me to sit quietly through Diane's presentation and let him do the work. So I sat. I folded my hands. I listened to my marriage get dismantled by a man who had never met me before this month. And I kept thinking about something Cooper had said to me about 3 weeks earlier. We were in my garage, building a model bridge out of balsa wood for his school project, and out of nowhere, he'd set down his piece and looked at me and said, "Grandpa, do you know what a lie of omission is?" I'd looked at him. "Where'd you learn that phrase?" "School," he said. Then, quieter. And, from listening, I thought he was talking about something that happened at recess. I hadn't asked him to explain. Now I wished I had. The morning had started badly before we even entered the courthouse. I'd arrived to find that Diane had already filed an amended petition requesting not just half of our shared assets but the house outright, citing her primary contribution to the household over 3 decades. She wanted the house in Worthington that we'd bought together 22 years ago, the one where Thomas grew up and where Cooper spent his summers. She wanted permanent spousal support. She wanted a portion of my pension. What she was describing wasn't a divorce. It was a liquidation. I'd worked for 31 years. Every promotion, every late night, every weekend project had gone toward that house, those savings, that retirement account. And the way Foss told it, none of that was contribution. It was just absence in a different form. During a short recess mid-morning, I stepped into the hallway. Diane was standing near the water fountain talking quietly with Foss. I approached carefully, keeping my voice low. "Diane." She turned, and her expression didn't soften. "I don't understand what's happening here. This isn't what we talked about. You told me we were going to handle this civilly." She looked at me the way you look at someone you've already made a decision about. "I changed my mind about what I deserve, Richard." "What you deserve," I said. "I'm not arguing that. But the way this is being presented, it's not accurate. My attorney thinks it is. Your attorney doesn't know us." Something flickered across her face then. Not guilt, exactly something more complicated. She glanced down the hallway at the door to the courtroom, then back at me. "You'll understand eventually," she said. "Some situations reach a point where the only way through is forward." She walked away before I could answer. Back in the gallery, I sat next to Cooper while Thomas stepped out to make a call. Cooper was still holding his backpack. He looked up at me when I sat down. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. I'm going to do something today, and I need you to not be upset with me." "What do you mean?" He looked at the courtroom doors. "I've been saving things. Since last fall, when Grandma started being different around you. I didn't understand what was happening, so I started keeping track." He unzipped the backpack slightly. Inside, I could see his tablet, the one my son and I had given him for his last birthday. "I have things on here. Important things. Things I don't think the judge knows." "Cooper, I know you'll say I shouldn't have." He said it fast, like he'd rehearsed it. But I knew something was wrong and nobody was doing anything about it, and I thought if I could just show someone the truth, maybe it would help. Before I could respond, the doors opened, and the bailiff called us back in. Diane took the stand after the recess. Foss walked her through a practice performance, and I say that now knowing it was a performance, though I didn't fully understand it yet. She talked about loneliness, about raising Thomas while I traveled for work, about trying for years to get through to me emotionally and feeling like she was talking to a wall. Her voice had just the right amount of restraint, like someone working hard not to cry rather than someone who had no tears left. She was good. I'll say that. Watching her, I almost doubted myself again. Then Cooper stood up. He did it quietly, without drama. He just got to his feet in the gallery and raised his hand like he was in class. "Your Honor," he said, loud enough that everyone heard, "may I show you something that my grandpa doesn't know I have?" Every head in that courtroom turned. Judge Patricia Harmon, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd heard every kind of story, looked at Cooper for a long moment. Foss was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the child isn't a witness in these proceedings, and I can see that, Mr. Foss." She looked back at Cooper. "What's your name, young man?" "Cooper. I'm Richard's grandson." "I'm 9. A pause. "I'll be 10 in June." Judge Harmon almost smiled. "Come up here, Cooper," He walked forward with his backpack, and I watched Diane follow him with her eyes. Her composure for the first time all morning showed a crack. "What do you have there?" the judge asked. "My tablet." He held it up. "My dad and grandpa gave it to me for my birthday. I use it for school mostly. But I also figured out how to record audio on it a long time ago, and last fall, when I started noticing things were different around my grandma and grandpa's house, I started keeping recordings. Because I wanted to understand what was happening. And because I thought if something bad was happening to Grandpa, someone should know about it." Judge Harmon looked at him carefully. "What kind of things did you notice were different?" "Grandma started having a lot of phone calls she'd take in other rooms. And when Grandpa wasn't around, she talked about him differently than when he was there. Like when Grandpa was there, she was regular Grandma. But when he wasn't, she would say things about him that didn't sound true. And she started having a visitor. A man. He came to the house a few times when Grandpa was at work and I was there after school." Foss stood again. "Your Honor, this is entirely Mr. Foss." The judge's voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight that closed his mouth. "Sit down." She looked at Cooper. "Can you show me one of these recordings?" He nodded and pulled up a file on the tablet. "This one is from October. I was doing homework in the kitchen and Grandma was in the den. She didn't know I had my tablet recording in my backpack. I'd left it on because I knew she was on the phone with that man again." He turned the volume up and pressed play. Diane's voice came through clearly in that quiet courtroom. And it was not the voice of the tired, lonely woman who had just testified. It was something else entirely efficient, almost cheerful, utterly calculated. "He has no idea, Franklin. None. That's the beauty of it. Richard trusts everyone. It's basically a design flaw at this point." A man's voice responded lower, harder to make out, but present. "The attorney says if we can establish the pattern of emotional neglect over the course of the marriage, the asset division goes in my favor. And with the house, we're talking about $200,000 split in equity at minimum. Plus his pension. He's been paying into that thing for 28 years. The man's voice again. Something that sounded like "and after?" Diane's voice. "After the settlement, I'm done with Columbus entirely. You've been patient, Franklin. We both have. But once this is done, we can actually have a life. The one we've been talking about." The courtroom was silent. I gripped the arm of my chair. "Franklin." I didn't know a Franklin. I had never heard Diane mention that name once in 31 years of marriage. Cooper lowered the tablet. He looked at me, and his eyes were the saddest I'd ever seen them. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I didn't want you to find out this way. Mrs. Hargrove," Judge Harmon said, her voice now carrying a different quality. Not warm, not hostile, but precise, like a scalpel. "Would you like to tell me who Franklin is?" Diane's composure shattered and reformed in about 3 seconds. "That's taken completely out of context. Cooper is 9 years old. He doesn't understand adult conversations. The recording is quite clear," the judge said. "Is that your voice?" Diane's attorney leaned over and whispered something. She shook her head slightly. "Mrs. Hargrove, is that your voice on the recording?" A long pause. "Yes. And who is Franklin?" "Nothing." Cooper spoke quietly from where he was standing. "He came to the house 4 times that I counted. He drove a silver car. One time they sat in the kitchen and I heard them talking about the house and how much it was worth and what Grandma's lawyer said about the pension. I wrote it down in my notebook afterward because I was worried I'd forget." He reached into his backpack and produced a spiral notebook, the kind kids use for school, his name written on the front in marker. "I have notes from 8 different times I overheard things." Foss looked like a man who had just seen his entire fee walk out the door. My attorney, Walter, who had been quiet and cautious all morning, was now sitting forward in his chair with the alertness of someone who has just realized the case has completely changed. Cooper wasn't finished. He scrolled on his tablet and pulled up another recording. "This one is from December. Franklin came over while I was there. I went to the bathroom, but I left my tablet on the kitchen counter. I told Grandma I forgot it, and she said it was fine. They were in the living room. This recording was longer. In it, 2 voices, Diane and the man I now knew was Franklin, talked for several minutes about the divorce timeline. About what the attorney had said. about the risk of Richard contesting the asset division and how to minimize it. Then Diane's voice said something that I know I will never unhear for the rest of my life. Thomas won't be an issue. He doesn't know his father well enough to take his side over mine. And Cooper adores Richard, but he's a child. What's he going to do? What he was going to do, it turned out, was stand in a courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, with a spiral notebook and a tablet full of audio files, and hand the truth to a judge who was ready to hear it. I had to look away from Diane when that recording ended. Not from anger, though the anger was there, deep and cold and real. But because I couldn't look at her and also keep myself together, and I needed to keep myself together for my grandson, who was standing at the front of a courtroom doing the bravest thing I had ever seen a child do. Judge Harmon called a 40-minute recess to review the recordings privately with both attorneys. As the courtroom cleared, Thomas appeared at my side. He'd come back in during the recordings. His face was pale. "Dad," he said. He didn't say anything after that. He just put his hand on my shoulder. Cooper came and sat next to me. He pulled his stuffed dog, a worn brown thing he'd carried since he was 3, out of the backpack and held it. For a moment he was just a 9-year-old who had done something very big and was tired. "You're not in trouble," I told him. "I know," he said. "I just feel sad." "Me too, buddy. Do you want to know why I started recording things?" I looked at him. "Because last September, Grandma told me that you were thinking about moving away. That you and she weren't happy and that you might go live somewhere else. And I asked her why, and she said, it was because you'd always wanted to live your life without the people who needed you." He said it carefully, like he was reading from his notebook. And I knew that was wrong. "Because you drive 2 hours every weekend to take me to the Science Museum. That's not what someone does who wants to live without the people who need them." He paused. So I started paying attention. I did not cry in that courtroom, but I came close. When the session reconvened, Judge Harmon's demeanor had changed in the way that judges' demeanors change when they've seen something they can't unsee. She looked at Diane with the flat, professional assessment of someone recalibrating everything they've heard. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "the recordings provided by your grandson, along with the notes he kept, paint a significantly different picture from the one presented by your counsel this morning. What I've reviewed suggests a coordinated plan to misrepresent the nature of this marriage, influence the asset division through fraudulent characterization, and exclude a contributing spouse from marital property to which he has a legitimate claim." She paused. "I'm also concerned by what appears to be an active relationship with a third party that predates this filing." Diane's new strategy was deflection. "A child's amateur recordings can't be considered reliable evidence of... The content of the recordings isn't ambiguous, Mrs. Hargrove. And the corroboration between what was recorded and the claims made in this morning's testimony is something this court takes seriously." Judge Harmon turned to Walter. "Counselor, I'm giving you time to file a formal response to the amended petition in light of today's evidence. I'm also ordering a full financial disclosure from both parties before we proceed to asset division." Walter was already writing. Franklin, as it turned out, was a man named Franklin Becker, who owned a landscaping company in Dublin, a suburb north of Columbus. He and Diane had apparently been involved for somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, a timeline that Cooper's recordings helped establish more concretely than anything else in the file. When Foss realized the financial fraud angle was being investigated, he withdrew from the case within the week. The proceedings dragged over the next 4 months. But the shape of them was determined that morning in March, when a 9-year-old boy with a tablet and a spiral notebook changed the course of everything. The final settlement bore no resemblance to what Diane had walked into that courtroom expecting to receive. She was awarded a portion of the marital assets based on the actual division of contributions over the marriage, not the fabricated narrative of sacrifice and neglect. The house went to me. The pension, which I had funded entirely through 30 years of work, remained mine. She received a modest settlement that reflected her genuine contributions to the household, not the inflated claim built on misrepresentation. There was no spousal support. The judge was direct about why you cannot seek compensation for a marriage you spent years planning to exit at maximum financial extraction. Franklin Becker apparently had believed Diane's version of events, that she was trapped in a cold, neglectful marriage and deserved better. Once the settlement came in significantly below what she'd promised him, He was less interested in providing the fresh start she'd been describing. The last I heard through Thomas, Diane had relocated to her sister's house in Cincinnati. She hadn't reached out to Cooper. That last part is the one that stays with me. It's the middle of summer now. Cooper is spending 2 weeks with me while Thomas and his wife take a trip they'd been putting off for 3 years. We've settled into a comfortable routine that I suspect we both needed. We wake up early, make eggs and toast, and spend the morning either in the garage working on whatever project we've got going right now. It's a small trebuchet for his physics class in the fall, or outside in the garden, which I've been expanding now that I actually have time for it. In the afternoon, we read or watch documentaries. Cooper is going through a phase where he wants to watch anything about deep-sea creatures, so I've learned more about bioluminescence than I ever expected to know at 64. In the evenings we eat dinner together, and he tells me things about his life that I think he doesn't tell other people: his worries about starting 4th grade, his theory that his best friend Jake might be having trouble at home, his uncertainty about whether he's actually good at building things or just thinks he is. I tell him he's genuinely good at it. Because he is. The house feels different. Not emptier, exactly quieter in a way that's taken some getting used to, but not oppressive. I've repainted the kitchen the color I always wanted, a deep blue-gray that Diane had vetoed twice. I had the back deck repaired and added a fire pit area that Thomas helped me build last month. Small changes that add up to something that feels increasingly like mine. I've thought a lot, in the months since the courthouse, about what 31 years of marriage actually was. Not the version Diane's lawyer presented, and not the sentimental version I might have told before I knew the truth, but the real thing, with all its complications. I think there was love in it, genuinely, for a long time. I think I did work too much in the early years. I think Diane grew into someone different from the woman she'd been at 29, and I think I was slow to notice that, and I think some of that was my fault. But I also know now that the loneliness she described in court was not caused by my work schedule. It was caused by the fact that she had, at some point I can't precisely identify, decided to stop being in the marriage while continuing to live in it. And the narrative she built around my failures was constructed not from honest grief, but from strategic preparation. Cooper asked me once, sitting on the back steps eating popsicles, whether I was angry at his grandmother. I thought about it. I was, I said. For a while. I think I'm mostly just sad about it now. Sad that it was what it was. Are you sad that I recorded those things? No, I said. Not even a little. He thought about that. I was scared to do it. I thought maybe I was wrong about what was happening, and then I'd just be a kid who recorded his grandma for no reason. What made you decide to do it anyway? He was quiet for a moment. Because I thought about what it would feel like if something happened to you and I could have stopped it and didn't. And that felt worse than being wrong. I put my arm around him. He leaned into it the way kids do when they're letting themselves be kids again, after spending too long acting older than they are. I thought about what it meant that a 9-year-old had seen more clearly than I had. Not because he was smarter, though he's sharp enough to make me work to keep up, but because he didn't have 31 years of trust clouding what he was seeing. He looked at what was in front of him and called it what it was. There's a particular kind of peace that comes after a long deception ends. It's not happiness exactly, not at first. It's more like the feeling after a fever breaks. Things are clear in a way they weren't before. You can see where you actually are. I know where I am. I'm 64 years old and I live in a house I own outright in Worthington, Ohio. I have a son who called me every week during the proceedings just to check in. I have a grandson who, at 9 years old, decided that the truth was worth standing up for, even when it scared him. I have a trebuchet to finish. I have a garden that's doing better than I expected. I have a retirement that is, against all the odds of the last year, actually intact. Last Friday, Cooper found an old photo album in the hall closet, the kind with the plastic cover pages that nobody makes anymore. It was full of pictures from his father's childhood. Thomas at 6, missing his front teeth. Thomas and me at a baseball game, both of us squinting into the sun. A Christmas morning that must have been 1,998, wrapping paper everywhere. Cooper sat on the couch for almost an hour going through it. He asked me questions about every other page. Who is this person? Where was this taken? Is that the old car? Why does Dad look so serious in this one? I sat next to him and answered everything I could remember. Near the back of the album, he found a picture of me at maybe 35, young in a way that seems almost unrecognizable now, holding a newborn Thomas in the delivery room, looking at the camera with an expression I can only describe as completely overwhelmed and completely certain at the same time. Cooper studied it for a long moment. "You look like you didn't know what you were doing," he said. "I didn't," I said. "But you figured it out?" "Most of it." He nodded like that was a satisfying answer. Then he turned the page. Outside, it was a regular Thursday evening in July, warm, a little humid the way Ohio summers get, the neighbor's dog barking at something in the yard next door. Cooper eventually fell asleep on the couch with the photo album still in his lap, and I sat there for a while in the quiet of my house before I carried him to bed. For the first time in longer than I can name, I wasn't dreading tomorrow. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones we least expect. A child who hasn't yet learned to rationalize what's right in front of him. Cooper didn't save Richard with cleverness or courage alone. He saved him by paying attention, by trusting what he knew to be true, even when the adults around him had stopped looking. The quiet ones who show up every Saturday, who drive 2 hours just to be there, they matter more than they know. A small note to our viewers. This story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment, and hopefully, a reminder worth carrying with you today.